In the final years of his life, John Lennon often looked back at the moments that shaped him most, and among all the memories, one stood above the rest: the day he met Paul McCartney. Long before the fame, the chaos, and the heartbreak, there was a simple meeting that changed music forever. It happened on July 6, 1957, on an ordinary summer afternoon in Liverpool, England. John was only 16 years old at the time, already carrying the weight of loss and rebellion. He had lost his mother, Julia, and music had become both his escape and his shield. That day, he was performing with his skiffle band, the Quarrymen, at a small church fete in Woolton. It was not a grand stage, just a modest event with families, laughter, and homemade stalls. Yet history was quietly being written there. Among the small crowd stood a 15-year-old boy named Paul McCartney. Paul had also lost his mother, Mary, and like John, he had turned to music for comfort. He watched John closely as he performed, noticing his confidence, his rough charm, and his sharp wit. John was not perfect on stage, but he had something rare: presence. After the performance, a mutual friend, Ivan Vaughan, introduced them. What happened next would later be described as one of the most important introductions in modern culture. Paul picked up a guitar, tuned it with ease, and played Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock almost flawlessly. John was impressed, but also threatened. Paul could do things musically that John could not, and John knew it. Still, something deeper connected them. They talked about songs, guitars, and American rock and roll. Beneath the conversation was a shared pain neither had to explain. Both were young men growing up without mothers, trying to find their place in a hard world. Music became the language they shared best. It was not friendship at first sight, but it was recognition. John saw in Paul discipline and musical skill. Paul saw in John confidence and leadership. Each had what the other lacked. Within weeks, John invited Paul to join the Quarrymen. It was a decision that came with risk. John feared losing control of his band, but he also knew greatness rarely comes from playing it safe. As they began writing songs together, something special emerged. Their styles were different, yet they blended in a way that felt natural. John leaned toward raw emotion and honesty. Paul favored melody structure and polish. Instead of clashing, these differences pushed them forward. They challenged each other, competed with each other, and made each other better as the years passed. The Quarrymen slowly evolved. George Harrison joined, then later Ringo Starr, and by 1960, the group became known as the Beatles. What followed was a rise unlike anything the world had seen before. From small clubs in Hamburg to sold-out shows across the globe, John Lennon and Paul McCartney stood at the center of it all. They were not just bandmates. They were partners. Together, they wrote songs that defined a generation, shaping the sound of modern music. Yet even in those early days, the foundation of their relationship was complex. It was built on admiration, rivalry, love, and insecurity all at once. John once said that meeting Paul was like looking into a mirror that showed both his strengths and his weaknesses. Paul later described their bond as being closer than friendship, closer than brotherhood. It was a creative marriage, intense and demanding, and while it brought them unimaginable success, it also planted the seeds of future conflict. This first meeting, simple and unplanned, was a spark that lit everything. Without it, there would be no Beatles as the world knows them. No shared songs, no shared dreams, and no shared heartbreak. Before the silence, before the separation, and before the final words were ever spoken, there was just a handshake in a churchyard and two boys who believed music could save them. As the 1960s began, John Lennon and Paul McCartney found themselves riding a wave of success that grew faster and stronger with each passing year. What started as late-night songwriting sessions and small club performances quickly transformed into something the world had never seen. The Beatles were no longer just a band. They were a cultural force. At the heart of it all was a Lennon-McCartney partnership, a creative bond so powerful that it reshaped popular music. Together, they wrote songs that spoke to youth, hope, love, and confusion, all while navigating fame that arrived suddenly and without warning. Their songwriting process was intense and deeply personal. In the early years, John and Paul often worked side by side, sometimes sitting face to face with guitars in hand, finishing each other's lines. One might bring in a half-formed idea, and the other would push it further, challenging weak lines and sharpening strong ones. John brought edge, honesty, and emotional bite. Paul brought melody, balance, and a natural sense of harmony. When these elements came together, the results felt effortless, even though they rarely were. Songs like She Loves You, All My Loving, and A Hard Day's Night came from the shared space of creativity, where competition and cooperation lived side by side. Fame, however, changed everything. By 1963, Beatlemania had taken hold. Crowds screamed so loudly that the band could barely hear themselves play. John and Paul were suddenly global figures, chased by fans, reporters, and expectations. They traveled constantly, living out of hotel rooms and tour buses. While the world saw smiles and success, behind the scenes the pressure was enormous. John struggled with insecurity, often hiding it behind sarcasm and sharp humor. Paul, on the other hand, tried to maintain control through discipline and hard work. He practiced endlessly, refined arrangements, and pushed the band to improve. Despite these differences, their bond remained strong during these years. They trusted each other completely when it came to music. John once admitted that Paul pushed him to be better, forcing him to finish songs instead of giving up halfway. Paul later said that John's honesty kept him from becoming too safe or predictable. Each acted as the other's filter, cutting away weakness and sharpening ideas. This mutual respect allowed them to grow as artists while staying connected as partners as the band matured. So did their music. Albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver marked a turning point. The songs became deeper, more personal, and more experimental. John explored themes of identity, loneliness, and self-reflection, while Paul leaned into storytelling, emotional nuance, and musical variety. Even as their individual voices became clearer, they continued to sign their songs as Lennon, McCartney, a symbol of unity even when collaboration was no longer constant. However, cracks were beginning to form beneath the surface. Endless touring left them exhausted. The demands of fame offered little room for rest or privacy. John felt trapped by the image of a Beatle, unsure of who he was beyond the band. Paul, fearing stagnation, pushed harder, wanted to keep the group creative and moving forward. These opposing reactions to pressure slowly created tension. Still, during this period, the friendship held. They laughed together, wrote together, and leaned on each other in moments of doubt. Their relationship was not just professional. It was emotional. They shared memories, losses, and experiences that no one else could truly understand. Being a Beatle was something only the four of them knew, and being half of Lennon-McCartney was something only John and Paul shared. That shared identity strengthened their bond even as it made conflict inevitable. Looking back, these years represented the peak of their partnership. The music flowed, the world listened, and the connection between them felt unbreakable. Yet success came at a cost. The same intensity that fueled their creativity also magnified their differences. As the decade moved forward, the balance between them would begin to shift, setting the stage for the struggles that lay ahead. That'd be why the mid-1960s. The bond between John Lennon and Paul McCartney was still strong, but it was no longer simple. The early excitement of shared success had given way to exhaustion, self-questioning, and the heavy weight of expectation. The Beatles had stopped touring in 1966, worn down by screaming crowds, technical limitations, and the feeling that they were no longer musicians but performers trapped inside a machine. For John, this decision was a relief. For Paul, it was a challenge. Without live shows to push them forward, the studio became their new battlefield, and it was there that the differences between them began to grow more visible. John was moving inward. His songwriting became more personal, more honest, and sometimes darker. Songs like Help and Strawberry Fields Forever reflected his struggle with fame, identity, and emotional pain. He wanted freedom, both artistically and personally, and he often resisted structure or polish if it felt false to him. Paul, meanwhile, was moving toward control and craftsmanship. He saw the studio as an instrument itself, a place to experiment, refine, and build something lasting. His songs grew more detailed, more melodic, and often more carefully arranged, as heard in tracks like Yesterday and Eleanor Rigby. At first, these differences worked in their favor. Albums like Revolver showed how well their contrasting styles could exist side by side. John's raw honesty balanced Paul's musical precision, creating a record that felt both emotional and innovative. This balance reached its peak with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, an album that changed the direction of popular music. Paul drove much of the project, organizing concepts and pushing the band to think bigger. John contributed some of his most memorable work, even if he felt less connected to the overall vision. The album was a massive success, but it quietly shifted the power dynamic within the band. The death of their manager, Brian Epstein, later that year marked a turning point. Epstein had been more than a business manager. He was a stabilizing force who handled pressure and protected the band from the outside world. Without him, the Beatles were left to manage themselves, and the cracks widened. John felt lost and uncertain, unsure of the band's direction. Paul, fearing collapse, stepped forward to fill the gap. He organized sessions, pushed for new projects, and tried to keep everyone focused. While his intentions were practical, his actions were often seen as controlling. This shift hurt John deeply. What Paul saw as leadership, John experienced as dominance. The partnership that once felt equal now felt unbalanced. John later admitted that he resented Paul's confidence during this period, even though part of him admired it. Their conversations grew tense, and unspoken frustrations replaced open collaboration. The easy back and forth of earlier years faded, replaced by silence or disagreement. The White Album sessions in 1968 exposed just how fragile their relationship had become. The recording process was long, tense, and emotionally draining. Instead of working together as a unit, the band often recorded separately, with each member focused on their own songs. Paul pushed relentlessly for perfection, reworking arrangements and demanding multiple takes. John, increasingly distant, brought Yoko Ono into the studio, breaking an unspoken rule that personal partners stayed away from recording sessions. For Paul, this felt like a betrayal. For John, it was a need for support and understanding. Their creative partnership began to feel like a competition rather than a collaboration. John mocked Paul's more traditional songs, calling them granny music, while Paul grew frustrated with what he saw as John's lack of focus and commitment. Even George Harrison, long overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney, began demanding recognition, further straining the group. The music remained powerful, but the joy was gone by this point. The friendship that once defined the band was under immense pressure. John and Paul still cared deeply for each other, but they no longer knew how to communicate without hurting one another. The silence between them grew heavier, filled with disappointment, pride, and unresolved emotion. What had once been a shared dream now felt like a burden neither could carry alone. And as the decade moved toward its end, the divide between them became impossible to ignore. By the end of the 1960s, the relationship between John Lennon and Paul McCartney had reached its most fragile state. The emotional distance that had been growing for years was now matched by serious disagreements over business and control, turning personal tension into open conflict. The Beatles were no longer just musicians. They were a massive global brand, and decisions about money, management, and the future carried enormous weight. What once felt like a brotherhood now began to resemble a fractured partnership, where every discussion ended in frustration. After the death of Brian Epstein, the band struggled to agree on who should manage their affairs. Paul believed the group needed structure and professional guidance to survive. He trusted Lee Eastman, his wife Linda's father, a respected entertainment lawyer, and felt confident that he could protect the band's interests. John, however, was deeply suspicious of Eastman. He feared Paul would gain too much control, and that the partnership would become unequal. Instead, John supported Alan Klein, a tough, outspoken New York businessman who promised to increase profits and take on the music industry with aggression. The disagreement over management split the band in a way nothing else had. George Harrison and Ringo Starr sided with John, leaving Paul isolated. The vote was 3-1, and Klein was hired. Paul felt betrayed, believing the others had dismissed his concerns without truly listening. John, meanwhile, felt empowered, convinced that he had finally broken free from Paul's influence. What neither realized at the time was that this decision would deepen wounds that might never heal. Meetings became arguments. Conversations that once revolved around music turned into tense debates about contracts and control. Trust eroded quickly. John began to see Paul not as a partner, but as an obstacle. Paul, in return, felt increasingly pushed out of the band he had worked so hard to protect. The emotional pain beneath these conflicts was rarely acknowledged, but it drove every interaction. During this period, their music began to reflect the growing divide. Each song felt like a statement of independence rather than a contribution to a shared vision. When Paul released his first solo album in 1970 and openly confirmed that the Beatles had broken up, John was furious. He believed he had already left the band privately and felt Paul had stolen the final word. "I started the band," John later said. "I disbanded it. The dream is over." His words were sharp, but beneath the anger was grief. The Beatles were not just a band. They were his identity. For Paul, the breakup was equally painful. He felt blame for something he had desperately tried to prevent. Public opinion often painted him as a controlling figure who pushed the others away, a label that haunted him for years. In truth, both men were hurting. They had built something extraordinary together, and now it was gone, leaving behind only silence and regret. The end of the Beatles marked the end of an era, but it did not bring peace. Instead, it opened the door to a bitter war of words that played out in interviews, albums, and headlines. What might have remained a private separation became a public spectacle, with fans forced to choose sides. The world watched as two former friends turned their pain into weapons. Yet even in this moment of collapse, it was clear that the bond between John and Paul was not truly broken. It was buried beneath pride, anger, and misunderstanding. The very intensity of their conflict revealed how deeply they still cared. If the Beatles had been nothing more than a business arrangement, the breakup would not have hurt so much. The pain came from love, from shared history, and from a partnership that had once felt unshakable. As the 1970s began, John Lennon and Paul McCartney stepped into their solo careers, determined to define themselves apart from each other. But the shadow of the Beatles followed them everywhere. No matter how far they traveled, they could not escape the past they shared. The silence between them grew louder, filled with words left unsaid, and the story of their separation was far from over. After the breakup of the Beatles, the silence between John Lennon and Paul McCartney did not last long. Instead of fading quietly into separate lives, their unresolved emotions spilled into the public eye through music, interviews, and sharp words. What followed was not just a professional split, but an emotional war that shocked fans around the world. For the first time, the friendship that once seemed unbreakable was openly exposed as fragile, wounded, and deeply strained. Paul McCartney was the first to release new music after breakup, and in 1971 his album Ram carried hints of frustration and hurt. While much of the record was playful and experimental, some lyrics reflected Paul's feelings toward John and Yoko Ono. The song Too Many People stood out in particular. Its lines about people preaching practices were not subtle to those who knew the history. Paul later admitted that the song was partly inspired by his resentment toward John and Yoko, whom he felt were trying to tell others how to live. For Paul, this was not an attack meant to destroy John, but rather an expression of personal pain that had nowhere else to go. John Lennon heard the message clearly, and his response was far more direct. In 1971, he released Imagine, an album that showed both his gentler ideals and his sharpest anger. While the title track became a global anthem of peace, another song on the album carried a very different tone. How Do You Sleep was an unmistakable attack on Paul McCartney. The lyrics were harsh, personal, and intentionally cruel. John accused Paul of living in the past, mocking his success and questioning his artistic value. For fans who had grown up loving the Beatles, the song was painful to hear. It felt like watching brothers fight in public. Even George Harrison became involved, playing guitar on the track, which only deepened the sense of betrayal. Ringo Starr, who visited the session, later said he was uncomfortable with how far things had gone. John, however, was using anger as fuel. He later admitted that the song came from a place of resentment and insecurity. At the time, though, the damage was done. The press eagerly amplified every insult, turning personal wounds into headlines. Paul responded differently. Rather than attacking John directly, he retreated into sadness and reflection. In 1971, with his band Wings, he wrote the song Dear Friend, a quiet and emotional plea asking whether their relationship had truly reached its end. The song carried no accusations, only confusion and sorrow. Paul later said it was his way of reaching out, hoping that somewhere beneath the anger, John would still hear him. John never replied publicly, but people close to him said the song affected him more than he let on. During this period, both men were struggling to redefine themselves. John wanted to break free from the Beatles' image and prove he was more than half of a famous partnership.